Okay, here we are. Let's see this aside. Ladies and gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, let us begin. It is 11 o'clock and we have to start on time. Okay. All right. Okay, here's a good joke for you. What's at 11 o'clock in a bagel? A JLI class. Let's begin. So I hope everyone enjoyed the last 2 weeks. This will conclude, today will conclude our 4 week, but feels like 4 months. 8 week. It's really 8. Well, yeah. 2 months, 4 week lesson course on Sinai and civics, and on the Jewish approach to the United States. We're still celebrating the, what's it called, the semi-bicentennial? Is that the right term? The semi-bicentennial? And
Semi-quincentennial.
what?
Semi-quincentennial.
Semi-quincentennial. Thank you. Okay.
Who is speaking?
Someone that's listening online. We have our secret sources. Anyway, so today we're going to end off with some really interesting things, and we're going to give you a little some school civics lesson. You'll feel like you're back in high school, because we're going to talk about the 3 branches of government. They say, let's work. Oh no, it's not plugged in. There was an old Yid. There's an old Yid, Rabbi Yankel, and he immigrated to the United States. He came to New York City, and he started living the life, the American dream. One day he's walking down Fifth Avenue, and he trips and he falls, and people rush over to help him, and the paramedics come over and they start treating him, and they ask him, we're treating you, are you comfortable being treated? And he says, well, I'm making a good living. Anyway, separation of powers. So we're going to start off with a video, and I thank Rob for trying to get this to work, and every week trying to get this to work. The video is going to give us a little bit of background, but before we do the video, let's just take a look at text number 1, page 85. All legislative powers herein granted, this is from the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, 2, and 3. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in the Congress of the United States, The executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States. The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in the Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. So, okay, I was waiting for you to walk in. I had it today. I'm going to take a little pause before we continue. Today is the third day in the month of Elul, and during the month of Elul, we prepare for Rosh Hashanah, for the New Year. And being as it is, one of the customs of the month of Elul is that we blow the shofar throughout the month. To be clear, this doesn't take the place of hearing the shofar in Rosh Hashanah. You still have to hear the shofar in Shul, although I will point out this year the first day of Rosh Hashanah is Shabbos, so we don't blow the shofar the first day. But we're going to do some shofar for the month of Elul. And now back to the class. So this is what we're going to talk about: is the three branches of government: the executive, the judicial, and the legislative. Let's take a look.
Eighteenth century French philosopher Charles de Montesquieu lived under the shadow of an absolute monarchy. He watched how unchecked power twists a nation. In the spirit of law, he presented a new way to protect freedom, arguing for three separate branches of government: legislative, those who craft the country's law; executive, those who enforce the laws; judicial, those who decide how the laws apply to individual situations. Montesquieu warned there would be an end to everything where the same man or the same bodies, the nobles or the people, to exercise those three powers. In simple words, freedom dies when power is concentrated. This wasn't just theory, it was an invitation, and America's founding fathers boldly accepted. After reaching King George, they gathered in Philadelphia to craft a new nation. Having fought to escape concentrated power, they were determined to create a system that would serve the people instead of the other way around. They sliced government into three centers of authority, each powerful, each limited, each watching the others. Their constitution reads, all legislative powers hereby advantage of the Congress of the United States. The executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America. The judicial power of the United States in one Supreme Court, and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. Congress makes laws, and Congress enforces laws. Courts interpret laws. Congress shapes the nation's laws and budgets, declares war, and approves major treaties, but it cannot enforce any of these. A president oversees federal agencies, commander in chief of the military, and head of nation. The president cannot make laws. Courts interpret laws for real-life situations that have disputes and decide if the law clashes with the Constitution, but they cannot create or execute policy. Each branch with a mission and boundaries. But America's founders took it one step further. They didn't just divide power, they made the branches collide with each other. The presidential veto can stop Congress. Congress, with enough votes, can override that veto or remove the president from office. Courts can block unconstitutional laws or actions, yet the judges themselves are chosen by the president and confirmed by the Senate. It's not chaos, it's choreography. A constant, deliberate tension referred to as checks and balances, built to prevent the spark of tyranny from catching fire on American shores.
So this is a system that we have with the three branches of government, and as explained, is there to bring the checks and balances necessary within our system. So this way, there is no power that is overbearing, because there's always going to be another power that can keep that power in check. This was based on Charles Louis de Montesquieu, and this is the way the US Constitution was written. So with that, we'll skip the next text, which is Montesquieu, which we just start watching the videos. Now, those of you who were in shul yesterday, in synagogue yesterday, you'll remember that I mentioned that we're going to talk about this concept that we're reading in the Torah, in yesterday's Torah reading, in today's class. And that's because yesterday's Torah reading was from the Torah portion of Shoftim, which the entire portion is dedicated to Jewish hierarchy. And, Jewish hierarchy is the wrong word, Jewish leadership. And among that is monarchy. Among that is spiritual leaders. Among that is prophets and other types of Jewish leaders that we read about. And of course, the judicial leadership as well. So we're going to read a text from yesterday's Torah reading, and we're going to see what is the Torah approach. So as we mentioned, in the US, we have these three. We have the legislative, executive, and judicial. Now, the point, as pointed out, was that there's no absolute power, because that can lead to tyranny. Torah has somewhat of a similar system, although not exactly the same. And that begins with the executive power and the judicial power. And it's interesting that both of these powers are read in the same section in the Torah that we read yesterday, about both the king, the executive, and the judicial authority that comes there, and how each of them keep check on one another. And the Torah gives the laws for both of these. Let's begin on text number 3, page 89. The Torah tells us in Deuteronomy, if the matter of judgment eludes you, matter of dispute in your cities, you shall rise and ascend to the place that the Lord your God chooses. You shall come to the Levitical priests and to the judge who will be in those days, and you shall inquire, and they will tell you the words of judgment. You shall act accordingly to the word they tell you from that place, and the Lord will choose, and you shall, from the place of the Lord will choose, you shall be careful to act accordingly and to all that they instruct you. According to the law they instruct you, and according to the judgment they say to you, you shall act. You shall not divert from the word they tell you, neither right nor left. When you come to the land that the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and you say, I will set a king over myself like all the other nations that are around me, you shall set a king over you, one whom your Lord God chooses. You shall set a king over you from among your brothers. You shall not appoint a foreigner over yourself, one who is not your brother. He may not acquire many horses for himself, so that he will not bring the people back to Egypt in order to acquire many horses. For the Lord said to you, you shall not return that way anymore. He shall not take many wives for himself, and his heart will not turn away, and he shall not acquire much silver and gold for himself. When he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write 2 copies of this Torah on the scroll. Copies from the scroll that is before the Levitical priests. The scroll should be with him, and he shall read it from it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, to keep all the words of his Torah and these statutes to perform them, so that his heart will not be haughty over his brothers, and that he will not turn from the commandment, neither right or left, so that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his sons among Israel. So what we find over here is the Torah is very specific in how we are to have a Jewish leadership and what their positions are and how they have to see themselves, what they are and what they're not allowed to do as well. So firstly, the Torah commands about the judicial system. And the Torah says you shall set up a judicial body. And it's interesting that the Torah says it shall be, where should it be? In the place that the Lord your God chooses, which is referring to, where does God choose? The temple in Jerusalem. And that's actually where they sat. The Sanhedrin actually sat in the temple in Jerusalem. So it has to be in God's home. And this is an important detail. The high court was known as the Sanhedrin, and the oral law tells us was made of 71 members, and their command is absolute. And the Torah tells us if there's any difficult questions, you bring it to them. You start off with the lower tier court, so to speak. The some courts made of 3. There's courts made of 20, and then you go up to the 72 of 23, and then you go up to the 72. But the Torah tells us very clearly, you shall not divert right or left, and we have to follow their laws and their making. It does say it's made up of Levitical priests, meaning Kohanim who are from the tribe of Levi, and judges, which means that either there could be judges not from that tribe or from that tribe. In general, the Torah does say that it comes from the family of Kohanim and Levites because they were supported by the community so that they could dedicate their entire lives studying Torah and divine service. So it's natural that they would feature prominently on the nation's highest court. But it wasn't an exclusive priestly club. Those who allowed themselves and wanted to dedicate themselves to study Torah and to be a judge or a spiritual leader was allowed to. Notice that there is one individual who is not allowed to sit on the court, and that is a king. The reason that a king cannot sit on the court, the Rambam tells us very clearly, Maimonides tells us in text number 4, a king of Israel is not seated on the Sanhedrin because it is forbidden to dispute him or disobey his word. In Jewish law, the king also has an absolute word, and the king has the right to decide anything necessary in his time. And therefore, if he were to make a decision on that court, it would need to be listened to by the others. Now, in general, the way it worked was, whatever. I'm not going to start comparing it to the way our judicial system is, but it's interesting to note that here you have judges. First of all, there are only judges, which means that they had to be educated people making those decisions. And the way it worked was that when it came to the decision, it would be decided first by the lower tier, the younger or the lower tier or whoever, and then only after that the senior one would come and present his findings, his conclusion. Why? Because you didn't want that the lower tier judges should be influenced by the higher tier judges. And so therefore, they would have to give their findings first, and then it would move up the ladder, so to speak. But if a king makes a decision, then that's the way it would have to be absolute. One second, I'm going to do it in a second. So, therefore, even though there were some great sages who were kings, for example, King David, King Solomon, there's no choice but to, but they cannot be part of the judicial system, even though they were also spiritual leaders as well, and people came to Solomon and David for advice and for help, and even for sometimes halachic questions, but they weren't part of the Sanhedrin. So after establishing the judiciary, the Torah now commands us to appoint a king, and the Torah system for a king is for Jews in Israel. An ideal setting calls for a king, and it's interesting, why or whether it applies to other nations. That's something that's complicated, not for today, but we do see the concept of appointing a king. And also get something very interesting later, maybe if we have time, as far as why the American system chose not to use the monarch. Yes, you had a question.
Was there ever one of the Levite one were in agreement with the judges and they couldn't come together?
You mean when the judges were in disagreement with themselves?
Well, was the two, because the two had to match.
Who had to match?
The Levite,
The Levites were the judges, we're saying. Some of the Levites were judges. The judges were the authority. The Levites did, if it's a, we're saying that the Levites, the Torah, so to speak, suggesting that it should be a Levite or a Kohen or a judge at the time, meaning it doesn't have to be them, but the Levites were not given any land. So their job was to be the spiritual leaders of the people. So naturally, it made sense for them to be also the judges, as they were the spiritual leaders. But it didn't necessarily have to be them. So if they weren't part of the Sanhedrin, they have no judicial authority at all.
because at the beginning, why did the judges and God said, let there be Levite, the Kohanes, and let there be
And the judges.
and
It means it says you're going to them, right? So in the verse itself is somewhat ambiguous, but in the oral law it's a clarified that it's talking about the Sanhedrin and the court, the way it's actually set up.
okay.
So the Torah is a bit ambiguous as far as how it's actually systemized, right? But in the oral law it's clarified that it's referring to the Sanhedrin. There's different levels of courts, as I mentioned. Sanhedrin is the Supreme Court, but there are also lower tier courts of either 23 judges or 3 judges, depending on what it is and where. Okay, did I clarify that? Yes.
How did the judges select Torah or Exodus 5, I'm sure?
So so the way it worked, and I'll do this briefly because it's a bit beyond the scope of our class. You had one rabbi who was ordained going back to the time of Moses, and you had to go through an ordination system. And if somebody is ordained, then they could be appointed as a judge. And sometimes they would be, moved up to a higher tier and to a higher tier. Just like in the United States, you have many courts throughout the United States, and they're not, you have lower level courts and higher level courts, it's all the way up to the Supreme Court. So the same thing is in every Jewish town, they were required to have some sort of court, and then if it was a larger city, they had larger courts. Certain of the lower tier courts were allowed to judge monetary matters, but if it was more intricate matters, then it had to be taken to a higher court. Okay. So now let's break down the Jewish monarchy, the Jewish king. So the king functions as the executive power who governs the people, leads the army, collects taxes, and maintains civil order. But in a radical break from the ancient system of government, the king was not above the law. And that's why the Torah says that the main thing is that he has to adhere to the Torah law as determined by the Sanhedrin, and he has to write a personal Torah scroll. Think about that. By the way, it is a mitzvah for every Jew to write a Torah scroll. Not everyone could afford that. Torah scroll today, buying the Torah scroll today is north of about $50,000-$60,000. But that's why when we do have the Torah scrolls, We encourage people to buy letters in the Torah so that you are actually part of owning a part of a Torah. And there's Torah scrolls that are constantly being written. And you could, we have some brochures, or you could buy yourself a letter in the Torah. But the king, in addition to having his own Torah scroll, he was also required to have another Torah scroll, and he had to carry that Torah a whole day. It wasn't sitting in a little ark, he had to carry that Torah. So they made a little Torah for the king, and he would hold that Torah a whole day. And what was the idea? The goal is that you're constantly reminding the king that we're totally subject to God and his Torah. And the law has to be interpreted and applied by the Sanhedrin, not by him. And he himself could be put on trial. Text number 5. Kings of the house of David may be judged, and testimony may be given against them. It says the house of the king of David, not of the house of Israel. Because they were bullies, so they didn't necessarily follow it the way the house of David did. But this is a powerful statement. The king is subject to the authority. We also saw in the verse that we read earlier that there is limits to the king's power. The first and foremost, no money. Well, he could have money, but he can't have an overabundance of gold and silver. He can't just have a collection put away just to say that he's rich. He can't accumulate too many horses. Horses is, back in the day, it was a statement of power. Today it's maybe, you want to say the presidential airplane, but back in the day, horses was a statement of power. And one of the main sources of horses is what was Egypt. Little interesting note that anybody follows Ocala's known for raising horses, and there are many Egyptians who come here for business. Many Arabians who come here for business because they want to check out the Ocala horses, right, Wendy? Am I right? Yeah, they're private jets. They fly in. So till today, Egypt is a big source of horses and Ocala, and the Torah says we shouldn't return to Egypt, and then the Torah says also not to have too many wives. I think we'll leave that one to be self-explanatory. So, well, up to 18 is the interpreted amount. Anyway, but the point is that what happens? Power is intoxicating. It gets to a person's head. It can make a ruler reject any advice. He start turning into a tyrant. And in the medieval age, Reb Saadia Gaon gives a psychological breakdown of the corrosive effects of power, as you see in text number 6. It is appropriate that I establish a matter that many overlook regarding the perils of haughtiness and power among them, that when people elate themselves and become arrogant, they go beyond their proper place and trample over the near and the far. They see themselves as unique in their generation, disparage everyone else's opinion, and mock and reject their words. They will even contradict experts about their own field. They will go so far as to question the Creator's wisdom and knowledge, opposing much of it, considering it incorrect in their eyes. Their hearts will lead them to enter into all types of dangerous pursuits out of confidence that their genius will save them, and this will be their undoing. So he talks about why we have to be careful about unchecked power. It inflates ego. They start to believe that they're totally unique, that they can do whatever they want, that they're experts in their own field, and they'll tell the general how to fight a war, the doctor how to practice medicine, and eventually it grows into things that is beyond the wisdom that God is giving us in the Torah, and God says, the wisdom has to come from God, not from yourself. And that's why the Torah places restrictions on the authority of the king and the danger of the king becoming too arrogant. And this entire system, and as we know, anybody who studied Nach, the books of the prophets, you see this is what happened to kings. So the entire system, an independent judiciary, a king who is subject to the law and strict limits on power. We have to understand that this was truly a radical idea in a world where kings were basically seen as gods. The kings are everything. The king is the god and could make that decision. They can enforce whatever laws they want. They are the ones that are in charge of the oversight. No one tells them what to do. This is the way the ancient world was. And when you have this idea of coming with a king that is subject to law, that was unheard of in the day. And maybe even today to some extent. Yes, questions. What year was the first king appointed? Well, it's about 3,500 years ago was when the Torah was given. The Jews entered the land of Israel. Second, I'll get the information for you. Which year was the first Jewish king appointed? 1050 BCE to 1020 BCE, King Saul. Okay, so there you have about 1,000 years BCE. So that was when the first king was appointed by King Saul, was appointed by the prophet Samuel. He was removed from his position, and then King David was the next one that was appointed after a very long and bitter the dispute, if you want, between them. Okay, now, any other questions before we continue on? Okay, you thinking I got some questions, but not.
got some, but
Okay. So now we've looked at how the executive and judicial roles operate within Torah law. But what about legislation? Who is responsible for making the laws? By the way, I'll say something as well. If you're asking about history, so I'll we know the famous Hanukkah story, and shortly after the Hanukkah story, the Maccabees, they took over as being both the Levites, the spiritual leaders, serving as the spiritual leaders in the temple, and they also became the king. And the sages at the time were very unhappy about that, and they said that the dynasty is going to end up falling apart because you're not allowed to, you can't have the same family running both branches of government. And sure enough, within a short amount of time, the Hashmonai family that we celebrate as Hanukkah sadly fell apart, and that actually was the beginning of the end of the Second Temple. So without getting into the whole history, but just to understand that these are things that happen throughout history. So we have to educate ourselves to bring a time when we'll restore the Jewish sovereignty the way it's meant to be, and to know how it should properly be done. So, yeah.
When Israel was established in 1948, they didn't want to have a king, they wanted to do it differently. What were they basing their government on?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a bit complex and beyond this class, but basically, you know what?
So,
I'll just say this: if you look at the verse in the Torah, yeah, if you say it says that go back to text number 3. And you look in the 3rd paragraph where it talks about a king. It says, when you come to the land that the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over myself, like all the other nations that are around me. Okay, so comes the question of what exactly does this mean? Does this mean that the people are supposed to demand a king? Or is it supposed to be that you are supposed that you should choose a king? So I'm going a little out of order here, but I'll just do this anyway. If you go to turn a little bit on your page to page 106. Not that page, the next page, the following page. So this is from Samuel, when the first king was appointed. Okay. The book of Samuel says, all the elders of Israel gathered and came to Samuel in Ramah. They said to Samuel, you have grown older, your sons do not follow in your ways. Therefore, appoint a king for us to govern us like all other nations. Samuel was very displeased with their request for a king to govern them, and he prayed to God. God said to Samuel, heed the demand of the people and everything that they say to you. For it is not that they have rejected. It's not you that they have rejected. It is my sovereignty they have rejected. And so, in other words, based on this way of understanding, it's that God says that if you're requesting a king, then this is the way a king should be appointed. But it's better to not have a king. That was the way Samuel saw it. That God was saying, if they request a king, even though they shouldn't request a king, because really we're not in the idea of monarchy, right? God is our one king. We don't really follow the whole monarchy, but still, this is the way you should do it if you are doing. One second. And so so Samuel appointed, and the rest of the story is King Saul was a disaster, right? Now, Maimonides, on the other hand, as well as others, understand that that's not the case, that actually it's a mitzvah to appoint a king. Take a look at text at the following page. Rabbi Maimonides says in the last part of his Mishnah that the Almighty made 3 demands of the Israelites to be carried out when they had possessions of Palestine. Okay, this was written from the Hebrew Republic, Jerusalem, going back to that time. He says, the first was that they should place a king over themselves. The second, they should wipe out memory of Amalek. And the third, they should build a temple. Okay, and then so that's what Maimonides says, that this is a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah to appoint a king, and then you shall you shall to drive out Amalek, and then to build a temple. That's the job of a Jewish king. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but basically the founders of Israel felt that wasn't the best way, because they felt that Maimonides' opinion was not following the way it should be. In other words, they felt that that the Torah was saying if you want to appoint a king, but we are following Maimonides, the law that he said that it's actually a mitzvah to appoint a king, just to be done in the proper way. If you take a look, and I'm not going to read the text, but at the following page, James Harrington, okay, he cited minority opinions in the rabbinic traditions that argue that appointing a king is not ideal. The Torah only allowed it for people who demanded it, and that's why in the United States they chose not to appoint a king. Okay, so it is a complicated discussion, and obviously, when they established Israel, they felt that they don't want to go that route.
But they do.
And well, I could, you could argue that, always claiming that Israel is the most democratic state. I don't know if that's always in the best interest of Israel. But anyway, I don't want. Let's leave this topic as it is. But yes.
But it's sitting in the ravine that at that point in time in history, that people would do what was right and just in their own times.
Right.
And many of the more fortunate said that led to chaos, because what was right and one person died was right to the other person. So that's why they went to Samuel.
Of course.
And said, we have chaos here. We need some kind of, not only legal, some kind of law.
Right. So absolutely, you're right. And so the king was necessary. So many people just interpret what Samuel is saying is that not that God was upset that they wanted a king. God was upset of the way they approached it. That they approached it in a way as if the king is the way to solve all our problems. But Samuel made a unified Israel, which was very difficult at that time. We can't get into the whole history, but yeah, he made a unified Israel, eventually leading to King David and King Solomon building the temple in Jerusalem, and the rest is history, as they say. So yeah, it was a very good thing that they appointed the king, but some say that the way it was done was improper. So I'm just saying that there are different opinions as to what is the best approach with regards to a king, but it clearly is a mitzvah to appoint a king. The question is how to approach it. Yeah.
First, that God said appoint the king, but he appointed Samuel the prophet. Did we start with the prophet?
It started with the prophets. For the first 400 years, there were no kings, and from when they entered Israel, but there was, as he was saying, it was very broken.
Clear.
And you guys studied the Tanakh. Everything was falling apart. Samuel was trying to bring a unified Judaism back together, a unified Jewish nation. And with that came the appointing of a king. But some interpret what he was saying was that God was saying that the way it was done was not the best way. Okay, let's move on. But we're going with the assumption, as Maimonides and many others say, that it is a mitzvah to appoint a king, and that's part of sovereignty in Israel, is to appoint a king. Okay, where are we at? So now, Prophet Isaiah says like this, text number 7 from page 95. So who makes the laws? So in this, the prophet Isaiah tells us, for the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king. What he's telling us is what we read in the Montesquieu's branches of government, which is judge, lawgivers, and king. The lawgiver is not one of those options in Judaism. Why? Because God is the one that makes the laws. We don't have a branch that makes the laws. God is the ultimate source of law and the ultimate judge. And an authority that the human being has is delegated by God through his Torah. And as a result, no one, not a king, not a Sanhedrin, can change any of the fundamental laws. So the legislative branch, the way you think of it today, is not someone that's creating a law, but it's working the system that the Torah gave us, laws that the Torah gave us, to find how legislation is relevant to the time and how that affects what we do. Because obviously in the Torah, it doesn't talk about self-driving cars. So how do you translate that into modern terms? And the same thing, there's always questions that's constantly coming up that's not clear. So that is the job of the Sanhedrin, is to find what is the Torah saying, but not to make a law in that way. Now, there are certain rabbinic laws, but those are generally in order to make a protection, so to speak, that we should keep the Torah laws better. So they don't have the authority to make new decrees or ordinances, but when the situations arrive, they have to function as the judicial system. Now, that's why the location of Sanhedrin is in God's temple, and it underscores that the divine origin of laws, and that's what they are interpreting and applying, the divine origin of those laws. And this is fundamentally different than a secular government, because every other government, the way it works is you have a system that creates laws. Okay, the human origin is by the people for the people, which means that you have you have a society, and the society now is creating the laws that have to be made because of the society. With God's laws, God is creating the society. It's a very different. So let's talk about the tribe of Levi. Maimonides explains their role. He says, text 95, text 8, page 95. Why did the tribe of Levi not receive a portion in the land of Israel and its spoils along with their brothers? Because they were set apart to serve God, to minister to him, and to teach him straight ways and righteous laws to the masses. As it says, they shall teach your laws to Jacob and your Torah to Israel. Therefore, the Levites were separated from the ways of the world. They do not wage war like the rest of Israel, nor did they inherit land, nor did they acquire possessions for themselves by their own physical strength. Rather, they are the army of God. As it said, may the Lord bless his army. And God provides for them, as it says, I am your portion and your inheritance. So the tribe of Levi was divided into Kohanim, the priests who serve in the temple, led by the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. And then you had the Levites, who were also there as well. They were the spiritual guides. They were guards in the temple. They own no land, as we mentioned. They're spread out in the cities throughout Israel. They're the spiritual guides of the Jewish people. And then you also had the prophets. There's also prophecy, who are not necessarily Levites or Kohens. Anyone could be a prophet. And that's also, we read about that yesterday. How do you know if it's a true prophet or not a true prophet? And again, what is the basic guideline? If the prophet is telling you something that advances the Torah and God's teachings and becoming a better Jew, then you know that that's a true prophet, that's an honest prophet. But if they are in any way trying to veer you away from keeping the Torah and its laws, then you know that it's not a true prophet. Very simple, basic. And again, that's with the same guidelines. The job of the prophet is to strengthen our adherence to the Torah and not the opposite. And as I mentioned, when there were kings that tried to merge these together, the sages were not happy with it. We had to have the spiritual leaders and then the monarchy as separate. The prophecy, as we read, again, also from yesterday's Torah portion, text number 9, I will set up a prophet from them, from among their brothers, like you, Moses. I will put my words into his mouth, and he will speak to them all that I commanded him. Whoever does not heed my words that he speaks in his name, I will hold them accountable. So this is someone that's hearing directly from God. And the prophet's role is to deliver a divine guidance. And often they are rebuking the community for not following the ways of God, giving warning what's going to happen, telling them that they have to repent and return to the ways of God. So they say that during the time of what we know as the Nach, which is during the time of the first temple, there were over 1 million prophets. What we have recorded are the prophecies that are relevant for generations, but many of the prophecies that were given were just timely. People, if people lost their horses, they would go to the prophet and say, "Can you help me find my horse?" That's what they did. That is true. So the Torah keeps these roles of religious leadership, the priesthood and the prophets, and they have to be separate from the government. And there's simple logic to this, because religion isn't corrupted by political power. Or at least you don't want it to become. And so it could be the other way around, which means religion could influence government. And we'll talk about that in a moment, how that's a little bit veering from the American way, or the American way is veering from that. But the prophet's job is to do what's right, and the king and the government is to uphold the Torah, which also ultimately that's what they have to do. So this is the divine system. God is at the top, and God's will is that the Jewish people should follow the Torah, and that's how you have the different branches of government. So that's what the Torah commands the king. It's true. Part of it is, as the Torah says, so that his heart will not be haughty over his brothers. So Torah does not want to completely corrupt him, which is why you have those things. But that's not ultimately what it is, but it is that he will keep the ways, that he will inspire them to keep the ways of Torah. And ultimately, that's what the job of all these are. We have the Torah, the way God is teaching us. How do you have to live as a Jew? And both branches of government, both the monarchy or the executive, as we'll call it, and the judicial, both are working in the same way to try and advance this. Any questions, huh?
Like, justice, religion, what's the last?
The prophet. This one is prophecy.
Okay.
Yeah. They probably should put it inside, but okay. Any other questions before we continue on? So now we're going to go back to the American founders, and we'll see how some of this they kept, some of it they didn't. So they built a government meant to prevent the king from tyranny, which was important, that they had experienced under the English king where they came from. They embraced Montesquieu's model of the three separate branches, but coming from a very religious-centered government, one of their major concerns was that a religious majority could use the government power to impose its benefits on the minority faiths, which has historically been a major problem, to say the least. So the Torah system of government has this unique theocracy that was designed for the Jewish people in their Holy Land. And even if there's non-Jews living in the Holy Land, they are not obligated to follow the Jewish way, as long as they set up an effective government that can enforce the basic law and order. Or we could call that following the 7 Noahide laws, as we talked about. And this is the way surely Israel should have been established, but it wasn't. They wanted to establish it as a secular nation. And we could talk about that at length, but we won't. So, and as I mentioned, that there were reasons that they rejected the concept of monarchy. They followed the other opinions, shall we say, the non-Maimonides opinions, that they felt that they read the Bible in the sense that the monarchy wasn't good. But anyway, they were determined to create a government that was of secular nature, not a theocracy. They believed that what worked for the ancient king of Israel could not be transplanted into a modern, diverse society. And they saw what happened in Europe, and they said, we don't want that kind of theocracy to affect our new country that we'll be founding. And to prevent this, they made the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, the very first amendment. Text number 10, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, the problem is that, as many parts of the Constitution, it is somewhat vague. So when you read this, a simple clause, it does two things. Number one, it prohibits Congress from establishing an official state religion, which is what establishment clause. And number two, prohibits Congress from interfering in people's freedom and practice of their religion. Now, it is a bit narrow, and therefore you have many subsequent Supreme Court rulings with disregard of what exactly does this mean. Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to the Dansbury Baptist Association, which was considered a religious minority in Connecticut, and they're afraid of the government interfering in their religious practice. And in his response, he wrote that he wrote a letter, and basically he coined this term of a wall of separation, what we know today as a separation between church and state. So this has become famous, and later Supreme Court rulings endorsed it, that the meaning that the government must be neutral, not only to different religions, but also between religion and non-religion. As a result, the U.S. law forbids any kind of religious instruction in Hebrew schools, in public schools, and this law of separation between church and state has brought about many legal questions, especially in the last century. Many scholars felt that it was never meant to say that there should be no religion in America, although some wanted to interpret it as that there should be no religion anywhere in public, in the public eye at all. There were those who felt differently, including the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who we've already quoted in this course and in the last course, that he says the point wasn't that we should get rid of religion. The point was that we should allow anyone to practice their religion. It's interesting, someone who, a friend of mine who was very involved in the military, and he told me there's something like when they have the military funerals, so they put a religious symbol. He told me I think there's something like 95 different religious symbols that they have. Yeah, so there's things that we don't even think of that people follow. Anyway, right, exactly. Text number 11, page 98. One of the fundamental principles that a child must learn in order to grow up to be a moral human being is that God exists and that the world has a master who created it and supervises its functioning. The child must know that the world has a master who has set up principles of righteousness, justice, and kindness, according to which our lives should be lived. In this manner, it will be made clear to him that the world is God's dwelling. Only through this behavior it will be possible to establish stable social norms. There are those, as mentioned above, who argue that taking such an approach in the public schools violates the principles of the separation of church and state. Their mistake comes from the fact that they view the subject superficially and do not try to penetrate to its core. One must remember that the United States was founded by religious men who came here seeking freedom from the lack of religious tolerance in other lands. Therefore, they placed as a fundamental element of the Constitution each person's right to follow his own religion, and thus restricted the power of the government to involve itself in its citizens' religious lives. However, their intent was not to prevent those parents who want their children to gain an appreciation of God from doing so. It's ridiculous to think that the founders of this country, who sought to ensure religious freedom, would place a clause in the Constitution that forbade the mention of God in nation schools. One does not content himself with merely a superficial understanding of the Constitution, but attempts to comprehend its inner intent. It becomes obvious that the promise of religious freedom without any limitations is one of its fundamental principles. So the point is that the U.S. Constitution, you have to look in context. They were very religious, as we pointed out already in previous lessons. That God is found everywhere. It's interesting, aside for the Constitution, but it is found in the Declaration of Independence. There was a Pew study that found actually that every single state's constitution has God mentioned in it, but not the federal constitution. But anyway, They didn't have any intention of completely banishing God and basic religious principles from public life in schools. Their position was that every person should be allowed to practice as they wish. So the motto of the United States, "In God We Trust," to say that it's literally found on every coin, and a child who's going to the grocery store to buy themselves a candy and sees that the dollar bill says "In God We Trust," yet that very dollar that God we trust is not allowed to be in their education system. So it's allowed to be on the dollar that they buy a candy with, but it's not allowed to be in their education system. That doesn't make sense. Clearly, that wasn't the point of separation of church and state. Today, we're facing huge challenges. To the foundational values of this country and the next generation, and we could, and I could suggest that a lot of what we're seeing, and we've talked about this in the past, and a lot of what we're seeing going down in the public schools is the fact that they don't have any high moral grounds to follow. And so that's why, as we discussed many times, the idea of trying to bring back somewhat of a higher power belief in within their children. And so it's built on these religious principles, but it seems to not pull through with the way the child is actually taught. Yes.
In Israel, when the kids go to public school, do they say a prayer at the beginning having to do with God? Because Israel is one country that allows any religion to come in I mean, there's every religion in the world in Israel, but what do they do in the schools?
Well, the public schools is not really public schools the way they are today, because the public schools are also religious schools.
Yeah.
So, if depending on the community that you're in, that whatever the community. Yeah, there isn't like a separate public or religious there. It's the same thing. So with this comes something that we've talked about a number of times, and that is the idea of a moment of silence. So we're going to talk about this briefly. We've talked about it at length in the last course. This was the Rebbe's suggestion to help out with the moment of silence, and why he advocated for it so much. And I'm going to show you something after I read this text, something very interesting. And we also talked about how we were involved in trying to get the moment of silence established here in the state of Florida, which is now law as well. Our senator, is he still senator? Maybe former senator. Dennis Baxley is the one that actually introduced it to the state legislature, based on the conversations that we had with him. So, and based on showing him this very text that we're going to read. So, solution for public schools is something that should be agreeable, because the idea of prayer in schools sort of fell apart over the years because of this idea of separation between church and state. But the idea of a moment of silence is fully constitutional, and it was even upheld by the Supreme Court. And even those who advocate for a wall of separation between church and state, they can be comfortable with a moment of silence. What a moment of silence is, we're not giving you any religion, no religion at all. All we're saying is that we are pausing for a moment to focus in a solemn way on the start of your day, to think about, what is my life about? What am I here for? What to think about a higher power, a higher purpose in life. And in the best case scenario, the children will raise the matter with their parents as well, and say, my teacher wants me to think about something, what should I think about? And now they're going to bring this up to their parents and they have a conversation. Now the parents have to get involved with in general, parents should be involved in their children's education. But over here, the children literally have to get involved. They have to get involved in the children, and hopefully they'll be telling them what they think. And, obviously if it's a Jewish child, you want them to think the Jewish way and the other religions as well. If it's a Christian child, let them believe what they believe. And if it's a Muslim child, let them believe what they believe. But that they should realize that there is somewhat of a higher power, that there's some purpose in their life. Because that is the number one thing that's driving children to be lost, to say the least, that they feel that they have no purpose in life. Text number 12. The only way to correct a present situation is to institute a moment of silence in every public school, the beginning of the school day before studies begin. While the student is still fresh, a moment of silence should be devoted to thinking about the creator and ruler of the world. Starting school day in such a fashion will have beneficial effects on the rest of the day's conduct, teaching a student to utilize his studies for worthy purposes, justice and righteousness, both on his own behalf and that of the public. Indeed, that the public good outweighs his personal good. It's important to stress that this should be a moment of silence, not spoken prayer. Should a spoken prayer be instituted, it is possible that students will not talk about it with their teacher. And who knows what their teacher will say, especially if she or he belongs to a religion different than that of their student. The teacher cannot tell students that he cannot answer them because they belong to a different religion. Thus, a spoken prayer will lead to all types of trouble, even things contrary to faith. A moment of silence, in contrast, has the advantage that nothing will be spoken, only thought is involved. Each student will think about what his parents and grandparents will tell him, avoiding any friction in the school. No one will know what the other is thinking. There's another advantage to have a moment of silence. Specifically, in thousands of families throughout this country, parents have forgotten their duty to be concerned about their children's education. They have abandoned this duty to the schools, the rabbi, etc. But even in best possible scenario, when the school provides a good education, the parents are not absolved of the sacred mission given to them. You shall teach your children. No matter how involved parents may be in their business affairs or whatever, they are duty bound to dedicate some time to their children's education. For regardless of how good an education the school provides a child, hearing the same thing both at school and at home carries more weight than hearing it only at school. Causing children to ask their parents what they think about during that moment, parents will be reminded and inspired about their principal function to raise a blessed generation of the upright, and will therefore dedicate time to their children's upbringing. So currently in the United States, there are many states that have this law. Many states recently adopted moment of silence in the last couple of years. And as the Rebbe highlights, that reminds the parent, number one, the children, and also reminds their parents of their obligation to their children to educate them. So as Jews and Americans, we should ask ourselves, is the God word used at home? Is God a real presence of our home? Does it influence the way we make our choices? Is there a prayer in our home? Do we ourselves wake up each morning and say, Moda Ani? Do we thank God that we have another day? Do we think about, why are we here? What are we here for? So living a relatively secular culture means people dodge the whole issue, even as they truly believe in God. And that's why we need to go back to this trend. So what he's saying is that when the idea of separation of church and state was never meant to say that we're cutting God out of the country, but rather it was just to say that we aren't enforcing any specific religion in this country. This question also came up in other areas. For example, the debate with regards to menorahs in public spaces. There are many. The ones who were primarily fighting it was actually mostly secular Jews. And their idea was, they said, how could you put up a menorah, separation of church and state? So the response was, well, and what are Christmas lights? And then this brought about a whole, and it actually came up as a Chabad case, and it went up to the Supreme Court. It was one in the Supreme Court. But this is the idea that we're not trying to erase a god or religion from the country. We're just simply not trying to enforce it in any specific way. You had a question?
No, because very often,
So they'll argue that it's not a religious holiday. They'll argue that it's not a religious holiday, that it's a social holiday, right?
So social.
Okay, so what should I tell you? Go make it your mission to go fight it.
You're fighting that.
You know, I know that it's become it's you're saying to have kosher food in schools, halal.
And for prayer, rooms their kids to go.
Well, I want to say something that may not be very popular in this room, but you know, there's a lot of rhetoric that's anti-Muslim rhetoric, and obviously, you know, I don't have to say it as a Jew. You know, obviously we understand what the terror, you know, the terrorism that's going on, and but as Americans, we should embrace the idea that Muslims, as you know, as religious Americans, should have the same right as Christian, because as Jews, we should recognize that we want those rights as well. And when you have advocates that are trying to take away those freedoms from Muslims, that could affect being taken away from Jews as well. And so we have to be very careful to not jump on that bandwagon, because there's a lot of rhetoric out there that's anti-Muslim rhetoric. You got to be very careful, you know, not to lose sight. Happens to be that the Muslims and Jews work together very well in a lot of areas. And you know, you mentioned halal. Muslims do eat kosher, and they work to try and you know, establish laws that are, many of them could be very, very, very beneficial for Jews. They work, I know, with the OU and other Jewish organizations.
For people in the television, it's not the Muslims themselves, it's the radical Muslims who are trying to take away everyone else's religion. And it's happening in just the smallest of areas of this.
Yeah.
What we see in the news, because of our media,
Right.
it's not Muslim religion itself. It is that there are regular Muslims that are pushing that nobody can have any other religion but that.
So I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you. I'm just saying it's just a very, we just have to be very, very careful, you know, with this type of rhetoric. That's all I'm saying. I'm not going to talk about any specific case, because that's not my place to be arguing that. I'll leave that to the lawyers. But I'm just saying,
Concession made in public schools for anybody's special diets and requirements.
I don't know. I don't know.
Because it
I would like to see that Jewish kids should have the opportunity to eat kosher. But you know, I mean, that they do have that in prisons or whatever. I'm just saying in general, in general, we just have to be careful with our approach to these type of things, is all I'm saying.
Listen. The one with the pack the lunch. It was big and great.
Yeah.
That rather than bury its threads, you have to be very, very careful on what line you stand on. Because with everything, you ever known about the experiment where a teacher raised up blue-eyed children, and then she did the reverse on her own children.
Yeah.
There's a line, there's a picking line, and eventually you make the next.
Right.
But in terms of making accommodation, New York City Publics has so many Jewish teachers that they close on the holidays.
Right, so there are
So
some
if
places.
you not want them to. Because you're upset because the other things, just be careful when you say.
Right, exactly. That was basically my point. Yeah. Right.
That there's a religion, and this religion has these holidays, and it's to our with school districts
Right.
to close on these holidays. You could be, what do you call it?
I think they should close on Sukkot and Simchas Torah too.
Well, that's being logical. It's
Okay.
This is all you need to do because.
Right. Okay, so I just wanted to show you something. And I know I've talked about our involvement with this separation. I'm sorry, with the moment of silence. I got this letter. Some of you may know, I think most of you do know, that my great uncle was a U.S. senator in the early 1980s, and these were two primary things that he wasn't religious himself, but my father was, and he was his uncle, and he brought him to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he was involved with one of the primary things with helping Jews get out of Russia at the time, which was a very hot topic. And the other thing was this idea moment of silence. So I found this letter. It's addressed from the United States Senate, Washington, D.C. It has his sign. It's addressed to my father. And this letter says like this. Here it is again. It says United States Senate. It's an official document from his office. June 16th, 1983. It's addressed to my father. It says, thank you for your letter and for sending me all the information on prayer in public schools. Please continue to do this so I can make a file and have the facts at the proper time. And he says, I love my wife and the children, and sincerely, Chick Hat. So this is just an actual document which I found my father sent me, where he writes that he's trying to compile the documentation to actually get this to actually have this brought before the Senate. I guess my father likes to claim that it didn't happen through him, but it happened few generations later. But anyway, this was just an interesting document that I found. So, well, that's, yeah. Anyway, okay, so this will bring us to the conclusion. But just to conclude, so over this course of these last 4 lessons that we had, we have discovered incredible influence Jewish beliefs and values have on the Pilgrims and the shaping of the United States, and you probably have learned some things, as I did, that you didn't know until now, and realize that not only the Jewish people, but the Torah, how much of the Torah teachings have an effect on the country that we live in, the United States. And this should be a source of good pride for us as Jews. Most importantly, it should inspire us to strengthen our personal commitment and embodiment to these great Jewish ideas that have brought so much blessing to our country. And so we'll conclude with an exercise. If you take a look at page 102, we're going to review what the 4 lessons were. Lesson 1 was the Pilgrims' worldview was shaped by their biblical faith in God immediately involved In the world inspired by Jewish covenant with God at Mount Sinai, America's foundations were laid with a covenant, a commitment that requires continual investment. We can live full and unapologetic Jewish lives in America and even leverage the American spirit to make Jewish life flourish like never before. I can integrate these Jewish principles and values into my life by, fulfill that. Lesson 2 was the fundamental American principle that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. It is radical Jewish innovation that changed the world. Being created in God's image is also a profound duty that generates immense responsibilities. And how do we integrate that into my life? Lesson 3, the American dream, the personal prosperity and home ownership was created by legal policies inspired by the Jewish Jubilee system. The inception that in God we trust and all American currency reminds us that the business affairs need to be guided by trust in God's involvement in every aspect of life. And finally, lesson 4, the Torah has its own system of separation between different branches of power, but its focus is on maintaining loyalty to God, the ultimate source of authority. Going to, so before we do this, just to give you a little bit update on what's going to be coming up in October. So the first course in October is going to be called the Kabbalah and the Hidden Architecture of You. And it is going to be a Kabbalah, it's going to be Jewish mysticism. I know everybody always loves the Jewish mysticism courses. We're going to discover what the soul actually does it's more about you, meaning questions that we have about ourselves and how that's answered in Kabbalah. For example, what happens while you sleep? Does your pet go to heaven? Why did you fall in love with the person that you ended up marrying? How does reincarnation explain? How do we explain things like that? The afterlife. These are all going to be rooted in Kabbalah, Hasidus, Arizal, and other Kabbalistic sources. So it's going to be a very enjoyable and somewhat intense Kabbalah course. It's a 6-week, yeah.
No, I can.
And no, we're trying to schedule around a couple weddings that will be taking place at that time. Right now we have, thank God, another wedding in November. So we're gonna have to see how we're gonna go about that. For those who don't know, my sister-in-law Sarah got engaged last week. We were just by the celebration. Yes. The next course is the winter, the missing piece, the foundation behind Israel's central place in Jewish life, and it's going to be more focused a little more on Israel. And true on this is Judaism's universal values to help us build better lives and society. That's going to be in the spring. So these are the upcoming lessons. I'm just going to, before I take questions, I'm just going to play the key points, and then we'll end off with any other questions if anybody has.
Establishing the signs of a straightforward school.
Yes.
No, just night.
Well, I said that the way that it was introduced to the Florida legislature was a meeting that I had with Senator Baxley. I actually showed him what the Rebbe said about it, and he studied those texts. And I also showed him a video which he watched on that matter, and he then compiled his what he presented to the Florida legislature. He presented it based on those teachings. So I mean, there was a lot more involved in that, but that was the initial presentation.
Lesson. The separation of powers in the U.S. Constitution provides the three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial, to prevent any one branch from gaining too much power, establishing a system of checks and balances that guards against tyranny. 2. In the Torah system for the Jewish kingdom in Israel, the king holds executive power,
and is kept separate from the Sanhedrin court, which holds judicial authority. 3. The Torah places restrictions on the king's power and conduct to prevent arrogance and ensure. 4. Unlike second, the Torah positions God as the ultimate source of authority, with legislative power residing in the Torah itself. The system includes independent spiritual leadership through the Levites and the prophets to safeguard adherence to God's commandments. 5. The First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution protects religious by preventing government interference in religious practice. Subsequent Supreme Court did this as requiring the removal from public education. 6. America's core values are explicitly based on believing in God and the universal religious principles. But weaken their foundation. 7. The Rebbe advocated the institution of a moment of silence, reflection, meditation. This practice prompts children to seek guidance from their parents, thereby strengthening parental involvement in children's religious and moral education.
Thank you everyone for joining. Yes, you wanted to share something?
Yes, I'd like to share some information. We all know about the three branches of government.